I stood alone in my kitchen in Queen Anne, watching the early morning fog drift lazily across the skyline. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if the city itself was still deciding whether to wake up. I liked that hour. 6 in the morning had always belonged to me. It was the one part of the day that didn't demand anything. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. I noticed it only when I lifted it for the third time and felt the weight without the warmth. I didn't bother reheating it. Cold coffee had become familiar. So had silence. The house was quiet in the way only long-lived houses are quiet. Not empty, not abandoned, just settled. The radiator hissed in the corner with a tired rhythm, and the wooden floors creaked softly when the temperature shifted. These sounds used to comfort me. They reminded me that I had built something solid. Something that lasted. I spent 40 years as a librarian. For most of my life, I organized the stories of other people. I cataloged them, protected them, made sure nothing important was lost or misplaced. There was dignity in that work. Books never shouted. They never demanded. They waited patiently to be understood. Retirement, however, was different. No one warns you that when the job ends, the silence changes. It's no longer peaceful. It starts asking questions. It presses against your ribs. It makes you aware of how much of your worth was once measured by how useful you were to others. I had been useful my entire life. The house was paid off. The routines were steady. The days passed without drama. And yet, that morning, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't name. The phone sat on the granite countertop, glowing faintly. I had been staring at it for several minutes before I realized my hands were trembling. Evan. My son. I hated that my body reacted before my mind did. A mother shouldn't feel fear when her only child calls. But there it was, tight in my chest, metallic on my tongue. I watched his name on the screen like it might change if I waited long enough. When I finally answered, my voice sounded thinner than I wanted. Hello? Hi, Mom. His voice was polished. Controlled. I could hear other sounds behind it, silverware clinking, soft laughter, the low hum of music. A restaurant. An expensive one. The kind of place where people didn't worry about the bill. I wanted to tell you personally, he said. Before you saw anything online. The fog outside seemed to pause. We got married yesterday. The words didn't echo. They didn't explode. They simply landed, heavy and absolute. Yesterday? I whispered. Yes. At an estate near Lake Washington. I turned slowly and looked at the calendar hanging by the refrigerator. A date was circled in blue ink, one Evan had mentioned months ago, a date he said was still flexible. I had planned around it quietly. Bought a dress that wouldn't draw attention. Navy silk. Modest. Respectable. It was still hanging in my closet, wrapped in plastic. We decided to keep it intimate, he continued. Her parents felt that was best. Her parents. They had a very specific vision for the ceremony, he said carefully, as if choosing each word from a list he'd rehearsed. They wanted a certain atmosphere. High-end. Cohesive. I knew what was coming before he said it. They felt it was important to have people who fit that world. Fit. The word slid into place like a missing puzzle piece. I didn't ask the question. I didn't have to. I didn't fit the aesthetic. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything but the faint hiss of the radiator and the dull thudding of my heart. I thought about the winters I wore the same coat year after year so Evan could have better shoes. I thought about the nights I worked late shelving returns, my back aching, my fingers numb, so he could attend schools that promised him a future bigger than mine. I thought about the night his father died in this very kitchen. How I held my son for hours, promising him he would never be alone. That I would always be there. I had been worthy of the sacrifice. Just not the celebration. There will be a small brunch later, Evan added quickly. For extended family. You'll be invited. It'll be more relaxed. Less pressure. A quieter version of belonging. After the photographs. After the vows. After the life-defining moment had already passed. I looked down at my hands. The skin was spotted with age, the nails short and practical. These hands had scrubbed floors, turned pages, counted pennies. They had built a life without spectacle. Is she happy? I asked. I didn't know why I cared. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps it was the part of me that still believed stories should end neatly. She's glowing, he said. And for the first time in the call, his voice softened. Warmth slipped in, the kind he used to reserve for me when he was a boy. Then his tone shifted again. Mom, there's something else. I closed my eyes. The wedding ended up being more expensive than expected, he said. Her parents ran into a temporary issue with some accounts. Just timing. A pause. The final invoice is $62,000. The number settled into the room like a heavy book dropped on a silent table. I told her not to worry, he continued quickly. I said my mom always has my back. I opened my laptop. The email was already there. Clean font. Elegant logo. Payment due today. That's my retirement, I said quietly. It's just a loan, he replied. They'll pay you back. With interest. I looked around my kitchen, the house that had held every chapter of my adult life. The house that had survived grief, work, and time. He was asking me to fund a world I wasn't welcome in. I didn't answer right away. Instead, a memory surfaced. Evan at 12 years old, standing in this same house, wearing a suit I couldn't afford but bought anyway. I had worked extra hours for weeks to make it happen. That night, he'd looked at me with absolute pride. You're the best mom in the world, he had whispered. Where had that boy gone? Mom, he pressed. The planner is calling every 10 minutes. We're boarding soon. I stared at the invoice again. Flowers that would wilt by morning. Champagne I would never taste. All funded by the woman deemed unworthy to attend. That was when the truth finally settled into my bones. I wasn't family. I was infrastructure. A resource. A fallback. A quiet foundation they assumed would never crack. I'll look at it, I said. Relief rushed into his voice. Thank you. I knew I could count on you. The call ended. I stood alone in the kitchen as the fog outside began to lift. Light spilled slowly across the counters. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt revealing. I stayed in the kitchen long after the call ended. The phone lay face down on the counter, silent now, as if it had said enough damage for one morning. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, untouched. Outside, the Seattle mist thickened, pressing against the windows like it wanted in. Or maybe it was trying to warn me. I opened my laptop. The email was already there. An invoice. Elegant. Minimal. Almost beautiful. $65,000. Flowers. Catering. Venue settlement. A wedding I was never invited to. I stared at the number, waiting for it to feel unreal. It didn't. It felt heavy. Dense. Like a stone placed carefully on my chest. This wasn't help. This wasn't family. This was extraction. My son, Ethan, hadn't asked if I could help. He'd assumed I would. Because I always had. I thought back to the years that taught him that assumption. The nights I stayed late at the university library, shelving returns until my wrists ached and my back burned. The smell of old paper and glue clinging to my clothes as I took the bus home. The diner shifts I picked up on weekends, scrubbing grease from vents until my hands cracked in winter. All of it so Ethan could have what I never did, options. And now, those years had been converted into a line item. "It's just a loan, Mom." That was what he'd said. As if my retirement account were a casual favor. As if survival were flexible. The balance stared back at me. $68,412. If I paid the invoice, I would be left with just over $3,000. $3,000 for the rest of my life. 4 prescriptions. 4 repairs. 4 emergencies. 4 dignity. I imagined myself at 80, choosing between groceries and heating, while flowers from his wedding wilted in landfills. And what made it worse, far worse, wasn't the money. It was the timing. He hadn't called me before the wedding. He hadn't told me when it was happening. He'd called after, when the bill was due. Which meant this wasn't about inclusion. It was about obligation. The phone vibrated again. A text. "Mom, did you send it? The planner is calling nonstop. Please hurry, we're boarding." Boarding. Honeymoon. While I sat alone in a quiet house, being asked to fund my own erasure. I didn't reply. Instead, my mind wandered somewhere it hadn't visited in years. A rainy Tuesday. Ethan was 12. He stood in this very living room, tugging at the sleeves of a charcoal suit that cost $300, money I didn't have. His eyes had been hopeful, careful, like he already knew the answer might be no. I'd smiled and said yes anyway. I worked extra hours for a month. Shelved books at night. Cleaned tables at dawn. And when he put that suit on, he stood taller than I'd ever seen him stand. He hugged me and whispered, "You're the best mom in the world." That boy felt like a stranger now. Because the man who called me this morning hadn't said thank you. He'd said, "You don't even need that money right now." That sentence replayed itself in my head until it felt poisonous. Did he know what that money represented? Did he know it was the sum total of every sacrifice I'd made quietly, without applause? Or did he know, and simply not care? Another message appeared. "Mom, please don't make this difficult. This is embarrassing." Embarrassing. Not hurtful. Not wrong. Embarrassing. I realized then something cold and clarifying. I was no longer a mother in his life. I was a financial buffer. A silent structure meant to hold weight without complaint. I stood up and walked to the window. The Space Needle cut through the fog like a blade, solid, unyielding, unmoved by the weather around it. I thought about Lena, his wife. How her parents had looked at my house once, years ago. The polite smiles. The pity in their eyes. The comment about how charming it was. How manageable condos were at my age. They didn't see a home. They saw an asset. And now, so did Ethan. The phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Mrs. Hale?" a cheerful voice asked. "This is Marcus from Northlight Events. We're still waiting on the final settlement for the Hawthorne wedding. Ethan mentioned you were handling it." Handling it. As if this were my responsibility. I looked at the invoice again. The clean font. The perfect alignment. The way it made debt look respectable. "I wasn't a guest at that wedding," I said quietly. There was a pause. "Oh. Well." Ethan said. "Ethan is a married man now," I replied. "I suggest you speak to the family who hosted the event." I hung up before he could answer. The silence that followed was different. Not heavy. Not suffocating. Clear. For the first time that day, my chest felt lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because I had stopped lying to myself. I had spent years trying to earn a place in a world that only valued me for what I could provide. I had mistaken sacrifice for love. And standing there, in my quiet kitchen, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't afraid of losing my son. I had already lost him. What terrified me was losing myself next. I closed the laptop. I didn't send the money. I didn't respond to the texts. And as the rain continued to fall outside, washing the city in gray, I made a decision that would change everything. Not a loud one. Not a dramatic one. Just a quiet, irreversible shift. I chose myself. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't pace or cry or replay the phone call again and again like I once would have. Instead, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. The soft creak of old wood. The distant sound of rain moving through the city. The quiet proof that this place still belonged to me. Morning came without ceremony. Gray light slipped through the curtains, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to clarity. The phone was still face down on the counter. I turned it over. 37 missed messages. Ethan. Unknown numbers. And finally, one message that felt heavier than the rest. From Lena's mother. We need to talk. This situation is becoming very unseemly. Unseemly. That was the word people like her used when something threatened the illusion they lived inside. I didn't respond. Instead, I made tea. Not coffee. Tea. Slow. Intentional. I sat at the table and thought about the last time Ethan had sat across from me without asking for something. I couldn't remember when it stopped being conversation and became negotiation. The knock came just after noon. Firm. Confident. Expectant. I knew before I opened the door who it would be. Lena's parents stood on my porch like they belonged there. Perfect coats. Perfect posture. Faces trained into polite concern. Martha, her mother said, stepping forward as if she'd already been invited in. We're worried about you. Of course they were. Worried people don't show up unannounced. They send messages. What stood in front of me wasn't worry. It was assessment. They stepped inside, their eyes immediately scanning the room, not for comfort, not for memories, but for value. Square footage. Condition. Potential. Her father spoke next. This misunderstanding with the wedding invoice has caused some complications. I waited. We thought it would be best, he continued, if we discussed solutions calmly. As adults. Solutions. That word again. They spoke as if the problem were logistical, not moral. As if I were a faulty part in an otherwise flawless machine. Lena's mother folded her hands neatly in her lap. At your stage in life, she said gently, financial decisions can feel overwhelming. We know Ethan didn't mean to pressure you. Pressure. She said it like a misunderstanding. Like gravity. Like inevitability. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked. Her smile sharpened. Well, she said, there are ways to unlock value without burdening yourself. Downsizing. Leveraging equity. Even temporary transfers. You wouldn't feel the difference, but it would resolve this embarrassment quickly. Embarrassment. That was the real issue. Not my safety. Not my future. Their reputation. I looked at them, two people who had raised a daughter who couldn't look me in the eye long enough to invite me to her wedding. And suddenly, everything snapped into focus. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a bridge. Something useful only until you've crossed it. I stood up. I'm not paying the invoice, I said. Silence. Not shocked. Calculating. Her father leaned back slightly. Martha, let's be realistic. Ethan's future is tied to this family now. If this bill isn't settled, the consequences will follow him. I know, I replied. And you're willing to let that happen? I met his eyes. Yes. The word landed harder than I expected. Lena's mother frowned. That's very cold. No, I said calmly. What's cold is asking a woman to trade her survival for your comfort. Her mouth opened, then closed. They weren't used to resistance. They were used to compliance dressed as kindness. That's when Ethan walked in. I hadn't heard the door open. He looked smaller than I remembered. His shoulders slumped. His confidence frayed. Mom, he said, relief flashing across his face. Thank God. We can fix this. Fix. As if this were a broken appliance. As if I were malfunctioning. He looked at me the way a customer looks at customer service, expectant, impatient, certain of resolution. Just pay it, he said quietly. I'll make it right later. Later. The word mothers live on. I took a breath. And for the first time in years, I didn't soften my voice. Sit down, Ethan. He froze. He sat. I need you to listen, I said. Not as my son. As a man. He nodded. You asked me for $65,000, I continued. Not because you needed it. But because you didn't want to feel small in front of people who don't care if you disappear tomorrow. His jaw tightened. You told me I didn't fit the aesthetic of your life, I said. And then you asked me to pay for it anyway. Lena's mother shifted uncomfortably. Ethan looked down. I didn't mean it like that, he muttered. But you did it like that, I replied. I reached for the folder on the table, the one I had prepared quietly, carefully. Inside were numbers. Records. Facts. I slid it toward him. You married into debt, Ethan, I said evenly. Not status. He flipped through the pages, color draining from his face. Foreclosures. Unpaid vendors. Frozen accounts. Lena stood abruptly. This is none of your business. It became my business when you sent me the bill, I replied. Her father stood. This is highly inappropriate. So was asking a retired woman to liquidate her future for your wedding flowers. Ethan looked up at me, eyes glassy. Is this true? He asked them. No one answered. And in that silence, something in him cracked. I just wanted to belong, he whispered. I felt it then. The last tug. The last instinct to save him. And I let it pass. You belong where you are honest, I said softly. Not where you pretend. He reached for my hand. I pulled mine back. I love the child you were, I said. But I won't fund the man you're becoming. His face collapsed. So that's it? He asked. You're choosing money over me? I shook my head. I'm choosing dignity over erasure. They left shortly after. No apologies. No closure. Just the sound of the door closing behind them. The house settled again. Weeks passed. The invoice went unpaid. The wedding planner sued. The illusion cracked. Ethan lost more than he gained. And I found something I didn't know I was missing. Peace. Not the kind that comes from reconciliation. The kind that comes from truth. I donated the dress I bought for the wedding. I planted new flowers in the garden. I traveled alone for the first time in my life. And one evening, sitting in my living room as the city lights flickered on, I realized something quietly powerful. My worth had never been a negotiation. It was never a bill to be settled. It was never an aesthetic. It was something I carried through every shift, every sacrifice, every silent night I showed up anyway. I wasn't discarded. I was released. And for the first time, the story belonged entirely to me.